Sam was a man trying to disappear into the woods, haunted by a war he couldn't forget. But his German shepherd, Shadow, had other plans. One rainy morning, Shadow stopped dead in his tracks and began digging frantically at the roots of an old oak tree. What he unearthed changed everything Sam knew about his past. A rusted ammo box, a faded photo of a fallen comrade, and the same dog. How did Shadow find him? And what secret has this dog been keeping for 10 years? This isn't just a house build. It's a miracle of fate. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The sky over Chicago was a bruised sheet of slate, heavy with the promise of freezing rain. A biting wind whistled through the canyons of glass and steel, whipping gray slush against the sidewalk. It was a cold, indifferent morning, where the sun felt like a distant memory, smothered by the oppressive weight of urban sprawl. Samuel Miller stood at the corner of a bustling intersection, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a faded olive-drab field jacket that had seen more dirt and sweat than any garment should endure. At 48, Sam was a man constructed of hard angles and hidden scars. He was tall, once possessing the broad-shouldered, barrel-chested physique of a man who could move mountains, but now he seemed to carry an invisible rucksack of memories that bowed his spine. His face was a rugged landscape of deep-set lines, etched by years of sun, wind, and the relentless pressure of a life spent in shadows. A salt and pepper beard, more salt than pepper these days, framed a jaw that was almost constantly clenched, a habit born from decades of suppressing words that no one would understand. His eyes were the most striking feature, the color of a stormy Atlantic sea, restless and hyper-aware, never settling on one thing for too long. They were the eyes of a soldier who had spent too many nights staring into the dark, waiting for a threat that often came without warning. Every time a car door slammed or a bus hissed its air brakes, those eyes would flicker with a primal, predatory instinct, a remnant of his years as a combat engineer in the U.S. Army. To the thousands of people rushing past him on their way to sterile offices, he was just another laborer, a man with calloused hands and a hard stare who didn't quite fit into the polished aesthetic of the modern city. Beside him, sitting with a disciplined stillness that mirrored his own, was Shadow. He was a 3-year-old German shepherd, a magnificent animal with a coat the color of burnt embers and midnight. Shadow was not merely a pet. He was Sam's silent anchor in a world that felt increasingly untethered. Sam had found him 6 months ago at a high kill shelter on the outskirts of the city. The kennel staff had labeled the dog unadoptable and highly reactive, but when Sam looked through the chain-link fence, he didn't see a dangerous animal. He saw himself. He saw a creature that had been trained for vigilance, abandoned by the world, and left to rot in a cage because his instincts were too sharp for civilian life. Shadow had a small silver scar running across the bridge of his wet nose, a mark of some unknown trauma that he carried with the same stoic dignity as the man who had rescued him. Now, Shadow was Sam's shadow, in every sense of the word. He weighed nearly 70 pounds of lean muscle and unwavering loyalty. He didn't bark at the passing crowds, he simply watched, his ears constantly twitching, his body leaning firmly against Sam's leg whenever he felt the man's heart rate begin to spike. Their bond was forged in the quiet hours of the night, when Shadow would wake Sam from a nightmare by gently licking his hand, pulling him back from the dusty roads of a desert war to the cold reality of a Chicago apartment. The city had become a sensory prison for Sam. As a combat engineer, his job had been to understand the structural integrity of the world and how to tear it down. He knew the explosive yield required to drop a bridge. He knew how to find the weak points in a wall, but in Chicago, he couldn't find the strength in himself. The constant hum of the electric grid, the scream of sirens, and the relentless chatter of millions of people felt like a low-frequency vibration that rattled his very bones. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, a man out of time and out of place. His apartment was little more than a bunker, a sparse room with a mattress on the floor, a crate for Shadow, and a wooden table where he sat for hours staring at the door. He had tried the VA meetings, the pills that made his mind feel like it was wrapped in wet wool, and the dead-end jobs that only served to remind him that his skills were obsolete in a world of spreadsheets and software. He was a builder who had nothing to build, a protector with nothing to protect. The breaking point arrived at noon on a Tuesday. A construction crew a block away dropped a massive steel plate onto the pavement. The sound wasn't just a noise, it was a physical blow. The clang vibrated through the air, and in an instant, the skyscrapers of Chicago dissolved. Sam was back in a narrow valley, the smell of diesel and dry dust filling his nose, the sound of a mortar round shrieking overhead. His lungs seized, his vision narrowed into a dark tunnel, and his hand reached for a rifle that wasn't there. He felt the cold sweat break across his brow, his mind screaming for cover. Shadow immediately sprang into action. He didn't bark. He moved with surgical precision, wedging his large body between Sam and the oncoming pedestrians, pressing his head hard against Sam's thigh and letting out a low, grounding whine. Shadow's weight, the warmth of his fur, and the steady rhythm of his breathing were the only things that kept Sam from collapsing onto the slushy sidewalk. As Sam's trembling fingers found the thick ruff of Shadow's neck, the world slowly bled back into focus. He looked at the gray, indifferent faces of the people walking past, and he knew he couldn't spend another day in this concrete tomb. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and felt the crinkled edges of a legal document he had carried for years. It was a deed to a forgotten patch of land in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, left to him in the will of Elias Thorne. Elias had been Sam's best friend, his sergeant, and the man who had taught him how to survive when the world was falling apart. Elias was a boisterous giant of a man, with hair the color of a copper penny, and a laugh that could shake the dust off a ceiling. He was the kind of man who could find a reason to smile in the middle of a sandstorm. "Sammy," Elias used to say, leaning against a Humvee with a crooked grin, "if we ever get out of this mess, I'm taking you to the Ridge. It's a place where the air tastes like cold water, and the only thing you have to listen to is the wind talking to the trees. You'll find your soul there, brother, I promise." Elias had never made it to the Ridge. He had died in a shallow trench, holding Sam's hand and whispering about the smell of pine needles. For years, Sam had avoided the land, paralyzed by the grief of being the one who lived. But now, as he stood on the corner of a dying city, he realized that Elias hadn't just left him land. He had left him a lifeline. The decision was made in a heartbeat. Sam returned to his apartment, his movements suddenly filled with the purposeful efficiency of a soldier on a mission. He packed only what mattered: his grandfather's hand tools, a crate of dry food for Shadow, his tactical gear, and a single-framed photograph of Elias. Everything else, the tattered furniture, the television he never watched, the ghosts of his failures, he left behind. He loaded his old Ford F-150, a rusted but reliable beast with a dented tailgate and an engine that growled with a mechanical stubbornness that Sam respected. By sunset, they were on the interstate, the jagged skyline of Chicago receding in the rearview mirror like a row of broken teeth. As they crossed the state line, the air began to change. The suffocating smell of exhaust and trash gave way to the scent of damp earth and cooling asphalt. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his ears flapping in the wind, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he knew they were finally heading towards something real. The drive was long, a 3-day odyssey through the rolling farmlands of Indiana and the dark, coal-stained hills of West Virginia. Sam drove mostly in silence, the radio off, listening to the steady thrum of the tires and the rhythm of Shadow's breathing. Each mile felt like a layer of armor being stripped away. He wasn't naive. He knew the mountains wouldn't cure him, but he hoped they would give him the space to breathe without feeling like he was drowning. By the time they reached the foothills of the Blue Ridge, the landscape had transformed into a lush, undulating sea of deep greens and smoky blues. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, and finally to a narrow, winding dirt track, overgrown with mountain laurel and wild blackberry briars. The trees closed in around the truck, their branches reaching out like old friends welcoming them home. When Sam finally reached the clearing Elias had described, he turned off the engine and just sat there. The silence was absolute, yet it wasn't empty. It was a living, breathing quiet. The rustle of dry leaves, the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, the gurgle of a hidden creek somewhere in the thicket. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the forest floor, and took a deep, shaky breath. The air was crisp and thin, tasting of damp moss and ancient stone. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a sudden sharp release of tension that made his eyes sting. Shadow jumped down from the truck, his tail wagging in slow, sweeping motions as he sniffed the perimeter, his nose twitching with the excitement of 1,000 new scents. Sam walked to the center of the clearing where the remains of an old stone foundation stood, reclaimed by vines and time. This was the place. He looked at the heavy gray stones scattered among the trees and the towering oaks that stood like silent sentinels over the land. He was a combat engineer. He knew the strength of stone and the endurance of wood. He looked at Shadow, who was now sitting patiently by the old foundation. And for the first time in a decade, Sam felt a flicker of hope. He wouldn't build a fortress here to keep the world out. He would build a sanctuary to bring himself back in. As the moon rose over the ridge, casting a silver glow over the forest, Sam sat on the tailgate of his truck, Shadow's heavy head resting on his lap. The echoes of the concrete were finally silent, replaced by the ancient, steady heartbeat of the wild. The violet hues of the mountain twilight had long since bled into a thick, impenetrable charcoal, leaving Samuel Miller alone with the ghost of a house and the weight of his own thoughts. In Chicago, the night was never truly dark. It was always filtered through the orange haze of streetlights and the neon pulse of a city that refused to sleep. But here, on the edge of the Blue Ridge, the darkness was a physical entity, a heavy velvet shroud that seemed to press against his skin. Sam had spent the last hour trying to coax a flame from a pile of damp hemlock twigs. His movements mechanical and stiff. The air had turned bitter, a bone-chilling dampness rising from the nearby creek that tasted of wet stone and ancient moss. The peace he had felt upon arrival, that brief flash of hope when he saw the silhouette of the ridge, had evaporated with the sun. Now, the silence he had craved so desperately felt less like a sanctuary and more like a void. It was a vacuum that pulled the air from his lungs, leaving him stranded in a world that felt indifferent to his existence. The ruins of Elias's grandfather's cabin sat just a few yards away, a skeletal heap of rotted oak and cedar that looked like the carcass of a fallen giant in the moonlight. Under the cold, silver glow, the property revealed its true, somber face. It was not the pristine mountain paradise Elias had painted in his boisterous stories. It was a graveyard of reclaimed timber and broken dreams. The roof had caved in years ago, leaving the interior a damp pit where the forest was slowly, methodically digesting the efforts of man. Sam paced the perimeter, his flashlight cutting a sharp, lonely beam through the mist. Every step on the waterlogged floorboards produced a sickening, hollow groan that echoed far too loudly in the stillness. He found the remains of the stone chimney, the only part of the structure still standing defiant, its hand-carved hearth filled with the ash of fires that had gone cold decades before Sam was even born. The smell was overwhelming, a pungent mix of decay, wet bark, and the sharp metallic tang of earth that had never seen the sun. It was the smell of things forgotten, and to a man whose mind was already frayed at the edges, it felt like a warning. As the temperature continued to plummet, the language of silence began to transform. In the city, silence was a luxury, a brief gap between the roars of the world. But here, the silence was teeming with unseen eyes and phantom noises. Every snap of a dry twig in the dark thicket sounded like the cocking of a rifle. Every rustle of the wind through the mountain laurel was a whispered threat. Sam found himself crouching low by the fire, his back against the cold stones of the chimney, his eyes darting frantically toward the black wall of trees. His combat engineer's mind, trained for 20 years to scan for structural weaknesses and hidden explosives, began to betray him. He wasn't looking at a peaceful forest anymore. He was looking at a series of ambush points and blind spots. The flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows across the ruins. And for a moment, the mountain air turned hot and dusty in his throat. The gurgle of the creek became the low rumble of a convoy moving through a hostile valley. He was no longer a man on his own land. He was a soldier trapped in a perimeter that was collapsing from within. The panic attack hit him with the force of a physical blow to the chest. His breath hitched, coming in ragged, shallow gasps that felt like he was breathing through a handful of dry sand. The silence Elias had promised was actually a roar of past failures, the faces of lost brothers flickering in the embers of the fire. Sam squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping his hair as he rocked back and forth against the damp stone. The isolation, which had seemed like a gift hours ago, now felt like a sentence. He was 48 years old, a broken man sitting on a pile of rot, hundreds of miles from anything familiar. The thought of staying here, of trying to build something from this ruin, felt like a cruel, impossible joke. He was ready to crawl back to the truck, to drive until he ran out of gas, to find any dive bar in a nameless town and disappear into a bottle. He felt the cold touch of the mist on his skin, and it felt like the grip of a dead man. "I can't do this," he choked out, the words lost in the vastness of the ridge. "I'm not a builder, Elias. I'm just a ghost." Just as the darkness threatened to swallow his resolve entirely, a steady, warm weight pressed firmly against his chest. Shadow had moved silently from his post by the perimeter. The German shepherd didn't bark or nudge. He simply navigated the narrow space between Sam's knees and leaned his entire 70-pound frame into Sam's body. Shadow's thick, coarse fur was a stark contrast to the biting cold of the air, and his warmth began to seep through Sam's jacket like a healing balm. The dog tucked his head firmly under Sam's chin, forcing the man to acknowledge the reality of the present. Sam's frantic breathing began to synchronize with the slow, deep, and rhythmic thumping of Shadow's heart against his own ribs. It was a grounding force, a living, breathing pulse that stood between Sam and the abyss. Shadow let out a long, low sigh, a sound of absolute trust and calm that seemed to vibrate through Sam's very bones. The dog wasn't afraid of the shadows or the ghosts. He was home, and he was simply waiting for his master to return to him. Sam's hands, which had been clenched into white-knuckled fists, slowly opened. His fingers sank into the dense, warm fur of Shadow's neck. He felt the dampness of the dog's breath and the solid, unwavering reality of his companion. As the minutes passed and the grip of the PTSD began to loosen, Sam looked at Shadow in the dim firelight. The dog's intelligent amber eyes were fixed on him, reflecting the orange embers of the fire. In that gaze, Sam saw a desperate, unspoken need. He realized then that if he left now, if he gave up and became a drifter again, Shadow would never have the life he deserved. The dog had been rescued from a cage only to be brought to a mountain clearing by a man who was ready to abandon him again. Shadow needed a pack, a purpose, and most of all, a roof over his head. The realization hit Sam with a clarity sharper than any military order. He wasn't just here to heal himself. He was here to be the man Shadow thought he was. He spent the rest of the night awake, but the fear had been replaced by a quiet, focused resolve. He sat by the fire, sharpening his axes and cleaning his saws by the light of a headlamp, the rhythmic sound of the whetstone providing a new kind of silence, a purposeful one. He watched the first light of dawn begin to touch the tops of the pines, turning the mountain mist into a veil of shimmering silver. The property was still a wreck, and the task ahead was monumental for a man alone. But as Shadow stood up and stretched, letting out a soft huff of anticipation, Sam felt a surge of energy he hadn't known in a decade. He wasn't just Samuel Miller, the ghost of a soldier. He was a builder. He looked at the rotted logs and the scattered stones, and didn't see decay. He saw raw materials. He reached out and touched the cold gray stone of the old chimney, feeling its rough, enduring surface. "Okay, boy," Sam whispered, his voice steadier than it had been since they crossed the state line. "We're staying. We're going to build you a home." The silence of the forest was no longer a threat. It was a conversation he was finally ready to have. The morning mist was a veil of ghosts, clinging to the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge like a cold, damp breath. Samuel Miller awoke not to the jarring scream of a Chicago siren, but to the rhythmic, persistent drumming of a woodpecker somewhere in the deep hemlocks. His body ached with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years, a dull, throbbing protest from muscles that had grown stiff during the long drive and the tense, sleepless night against the chimney stones. At 48, the damp mountain air settled into his joints like rusted iron, but as he looked down at Shadow, who was already awake and watching him with ears pricked, the lethargy evaporated. The decision of the night before had solidified into a mission. Sam stood up, his bones popping in the quiet morning, and surveyed the ruins of Elias's grandfather's cabin once more. In the gray light of dawn, the heap of rotted timber and tangled vines looked less like a graveyard and more like a challenge. He didn't see the decay anymore. He saw the debris that needed to be cleared before the new life could begin. He was a combat engineer, and in the Army, the first step to building anything was the brutal, unglamorous labor of clearing the site. He reached for his heavy demolition bar and a rusted shovel he had salvaged from the truck, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. The work began with a primal violence. Sam threw himself into the demolition of the old structure, using his crowbar to pry apart the sodden, termite-eaten logs that had once been walls. Every crack of splintering wood felt like a release valve for the pressure building in his chest. He didn't work with the careful precision of a carpenter. He worked with the desperate, punishing energy of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. He tore at the thick mats of ivy and blackberry briars that had strangled the old stone hearth, his hands becoming scratched and bloodied. But he barely noticed the pain. In fact, he welcomed it. The physical agony was a distraction, a way to drown out the internal noise that usually haunted his silence. Each heavy log he hauled away, each bucket of rotted debris he dumped into a pile at the edge of the clearing felt like he was removing a piece of the city's filth from his soul. He was a man possessed, his field jacket discarded on a stump, his graying undershirt soaked through with sweat despite the biting mountain chill. He wanted to be exhausted. He wanted to reach the point where his mind was too tired to remember the smell of cordite or the sound of a medic's frantic shouting. Shadow proved to be an uncanny partner in this grueling endeavor. The German Shepherd didn't just sit and watch. He seemed to understand the rhythm of the work. When Sam struggled to drag a particularly heavy, waterlogged beam away from the site, Shadow would move in, gripping a protruding branch or a loose piece of timber, with his powerful jaws and pulling alongside his master. His lean, muscular frame strained with effort, his paws digging into the soft mountain earth for leverage. There was a silent, professional coordination between them that transcended the bond of man and pet. When Sam stopped to catch his breath, leaning heavily on his shovel with his chest heaving, Shadow would immediately shift his role. He would circle the clearing, his nose to the ground and his ears rotating like radar dishes, ensuring that the perimeter was secure. He was the perfect sentry, allowing Sam the luxury of focusing entirely on the task at hand. The dog's presence was a constant stabilizing force, a reminder that Sam wasn't just working for himself anymore. He was building a den for the only creature that truly knew the weight of his heart. By midday, Sam had cleared the footprint of the old cabin down to the bare, dark earth. Now came the hardest part, digging the foundation trench. In his years of service, Sam had dug countless foxholes, trenches, and fortifications. But those had been for survival in a world of war. This trench was different. This was for permanence. He marked out a rectangular perimeter, slightly larger than the original structure, using stakes he had whittled from cedar branches. Then he began to dig. The soil was a stubborn mix of heavy red clay and ancient embedded river stones. Every strike of the shovel was a jolt to his shoulders, every heave of the heavy earth a strain on his lower back. He dug until his palms blistered, and then he dug until the blisters popped and his skin turned raw. He didn't stop to eat, only pausing to drink cold water from a canteen. He was using the labor as a form of penance, a way to punish the body for the failures of the mind. He felt that if he could just dig deep enough, if he could sweat enough, he could bury the ghosts of Chicago and the desert beneath the foundation of this new home. Every spadeful of dirt he tossed aside was a piece of the old Sam being discarded, a step further away from the man who had almost given up in that Chicago apartment. As the sun began to arc toward the western peaks, Sam moved his operation to the creek that ran along the edge of the property. He needed stone, large, flat river stones that could form a solid, unyielding base for his walls. The water was icy, numbing his feet through his leather boots as he waded into the shallows. He looked for stones that had been smoothed by 1,000 years of mountain runoff, heavy gray slabs of granite and sandstone. Finding them was easy. Moving them was a feat of engineering. He used a long pry bar and a series of rollers made from saplings to move the massive stones from the water's edge up the slope to the clearing. It was backbreaking, agonizing work. He moved one stone at a time, his muscles quivering under the weight, his breath coming in sharp, guttural grunts. Shadow stayed close, nudging Sam's hand whenever the man seemed to falter, his warm presence a constant encouragement. There was a strange meditative quality to the labor. The weight of the stones was honest. They didn't lie, they didn't judge, and they didn't demand anything but strength. The first stone was the largest, a massive flat slab of blue-gray granite that Sam had designated as the cornerstone. It took him 2 hours to position it correctly at the corner of the trench. When it finally slid into place with a heavy, final thud, Sam collapsed beside it, his back against the cool stone and his head tilted back toward the canopy of oaks. His hands were shaking, his body was a map of aches, and he was covered in the red clay of the ridge. But for the first time in 10 years, he felt a flicker of genuine pride. He reached out and patted the stone, feeling its cold, enduring surface. This wasn't a temporary fortification, this was the beginning of a life. Every stone he laid from here on out would be a brick in the wall he was building between himself and his past. He looked at Shadow, who was sitting regally beside the new cornerstone, the dog's fur dusted with the same red clay. Sam realized that they were both being remade by this land. They were no longer the broken refugees who had fled the city in a rusted truck. They were becoming part of the mountain itself. As the first evening stars began to appear through the leaves, Sam didn't feel the usual creeping dread of the night. He felt the heavy, honest exhaustion of a man who had earned his place on the earth. He had laid the first stone, and in doing so, he had anchored his soul to the ridge. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick canopy of oak and pine, casting long, fractured shadows across the muddy footprint of Samuel Miller's future home. Sam moved with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man whose body was a map of protests. Every muscle in his back felt like a frayed cable, and his hands, though calloused, throbbed with the heat of a dozen minor abrasions. He had spent the early hours hauling more river stones, the rhythmic grunt of his exertion the only sound in the clearing, until Shadow's behavior changed. The German shepherd, who had been resting near the cornerstone, suddenly stood bolt upright. His ears, large and alert, swiveled like radar dishes toward the narrow, overgrown path that led down the ridge toward the distant town of Blackwood. Shadow didn't bark, but a low, guttural vibration started in his chest, a warning, not of a predator, but of an approaching unknown. Sam immediately dropped the heavy stone he was carrying, his heart rate spiking with a familiar, unwelcome jolt of adrenaline. He reached for the handle of his felling axe, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. His military mind, never truly dormant, began calculating distances and cover, his breath becoming shallow. But as the figure emerged from the veil of mountain laurel, the tension in Sam's shoulders didn't break. It simply transformed into profound confusion. Walking toward him was not a threat, but a woman who seemed to have stepped out of a different century. She was tall and slender, moving with a surprising grace for someone who appeared to be in her 70s. Her hair was a striking, untamed silver, gathered loosely at the nape of her neck with a simple leather cord, and her skin was the color of toasted almonds, etched with a fine lace of wrinkles that spoke of a life lived entirely in the sun and wind. She wore a practical faded denim chore coat over a floral print dress, and her sturdy leather boots were caked with the same red clay that now defined Sam's existence. In her hands, she carried a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth, the scent of cinnamon and baked fruit wafting ahead of her like a peace offering. This was Sarah Higgins, a woman whose family had lived on the neighboring ridge for 3 generations, known by the locals as a healer and a keeper of stories. Her eyes were a piercing, intelligent blue, possessed of a clarity that seemed to look right through Sam's defensive posture and into the weary soul beneath. Sam stood frozen, feeling absurdly oversized and out of place with his axe in hand, a relic of a war zone, standing in a garden of peace. Sarah stopped a respectful distance away, her gaze lingering on the stone foundation before shifting to Shadow. As her eyes landed on the German shepherd, her breath caught audibly. A look of profound amazement, almost a ghostly recognition, flickered across her weathered features. She didn't move toward the dog, but her hand trembled slightly against the handle of her basket. Shadow, usually wary of strangers, did something that stunned Sam. He lowered his head, his tail giving a single, tentative sweep against the dirt, and let out a soft, inquisitive whimper. Sarah didn't explain her reaction. Instead, she forced a gentle, knowing smile and looked back at Sam. Rungya luon biet kach juan hung ngoi that lak trove, she said, in a voice that was as warm and textured as well-worn velvet. The old forest always knows how to bring back those who were lost. Her English was colored by a thick, melodic Appalachian lilt, a cadence that felt like the wind through the pines. She stepped forward and placed the basket on a flat stump, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. I'm Sarah. I heard the axe work from across the hollow. I figured anyone working this hard in the dirt deserves something better than a tin of cold beans. Sam slowly lowered the axe, his fingers uncurling from the hickory handle. He hadn't spoken to a soul other than Shadow in weeks, and his throat felt tight, his social muscles as atrophied as his sense of safety. I'm Sam, he managed to rasp, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. He felt a wave of shame at his disheveled appearance, covered in mud, sweat-stained and smelling of wood smoke. But Sarah didn't seem to mind. She pulled back the cloth of the basket to reveal a deep-dish apple pie, still warm enough to let out a plume of steam. Elias would be proud to see someone finally pulling the weeds off this plot, she remarked, her eyes softening as she looked at the ruins. Sam felt a jolt at the mention of his friend's name. You knew him? He asked, stepping closer. Sarah nodded, sitting down on the fallen log Sam had been using as a bench. I knew him since he was a boy with skinned knees. He used to come to my porch to hear tales of the mountains. He loved this ridge more than any man I ever met. He used to sit right where you're standing and talk about how the stones here were honest. He told me once that if he ever got lost in the world, he'd find his way back to these oaks. The conversation that followed was the first true human connection Sam had allowed himself since his discharge. Sarah spoke of Elias not as a soldier or a tragedy, but as a vibrant, red-haired young man who believed that building something with your hands was the only way to talk to God. She told Sam about the history of the foundation he was clearing, how Elias's grandfather had hand-quarried the blue granite during the Great Depression, believing that a house built of stone would never let its family feel the cold of the world. Through Sarah's words, the clearing began to transform. It was no longer just a site of backbreaking labor and penance for Sam. It was a sacred trust. He realized that Elias hadn't just left him land. He had left him a place in a story. Sarah's presence brought with it a sense of continuity, a bridge between the lonely, haunted man Sam had become and the community of hardy, resilient mountain folk who had survived these ridges for centuries. She talked about the coming winter, the way the deer moved through the hollow, and which springs ran sweet even in a drought. For the first time, Sam wasn't just surviving, he was learning. As Sarah prepared to leave, she paused once more to look at Shadow. The dog was sitting regally beside her, his amber eyes fixed on her face with a strange, haunting intensity. Sarah reached out, her gnarled fingers hovering just inches from Shadow's ears, before she withdrew them with a soft sigh. She didn't say why the dog moved her so deeply, but the mystery hung in the air like the scent of the apple pie. You've got a good friend there, Sam Miller, she whispered. More than you know, I suspect. She picked up her empty basket and adjusted her coat. Blackwood isn't far. If you need a hand with the heavy beams or a hot meal, you just come down the trail. We don't much care for the noise of the world down there, but we take care of our own. As she disappeared back into the mist, Sam felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. The isolation of the ridge had been punctured, not by a threat, but by the sweetness of compassion. He looked at the pie, then at Shadow, and then at the cornerstone he had laid. He wasn't just building a house anymore. He was building a life in a place that already seemed to know his name. He picked up his shovel, but the weight of it felt lighter. The community he had rejected in the city had found him here, in the silence, and for the first time in 10 years, Samuel Miller didn't feel like a ghost. The morning air on the ridge had sharpened into a biting blade of autumn frost, turning the vibrant greens of the Appalachian forest into a mosaic of burnt orange and defiant crimson. Samuel Miller stood before a towering white pine, a centurion of the forest that stood nearly 80 feet tall, its thick bark plated like ancient armor. For a combat engineer who had spent years calculating the structural integrity of bridges and bunkers, felling this giant was a task of both geometry and grit. He needed the long, straight trunk for the main ridge beam of his house, the backbone that would hold the weight of the roof against the coming mountain snows. Sam's muscles, though perpetually sore, had begun to harden into a new kind of functional strength, a sinewy endurance that Chicago's gymnasiums could never provide. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve, his stormy eyes assessing the lean of the tree and the direction of the wind. Shadow stood a few yards back, his tawny and black coat blending into the fallen leaves, his amber eyes fixed on Sam with a silent, unwavering focus. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the day's work, his body poised like a coiled spring, as ready for a command that hadn't yet been spoken. The work began with the rhythmic, biting thud of Sam's felling axe. Each swing was a testament to his focus, the steel head burying itself deep into the sap-filled wood. He carved a perfect notch, the mouth of the fall, ensuring the giant would drop exactly where he wanted it, away from the stone foundation and into a clear corridor of the forest. After hours of grueling labor, Sam switched to his long cross-cut saw. The metallic shur-shur of the blade sang through the silence, a lonely duet between man and timber, but nature is rarely as predictable as a blueprint. As the final fibers of the pine began to groan and snap, a sudden freakish gust of wind, a mountain ghost as Sarah called them, roared through the hollow. The massive tree, already in its death throes, shuddered and twisted violently on its stump. Sam scrambled to retreat, his boots sliding on the damp pine needles, but he wasn't fast enough. The base of the trunk kickbacked with the force of a hydraulic ram. A sickening crunch echoed through the clearing as the weight of several tons of ancient timber pinned Sam's left leg against a granite outcropping. The world vanished into a white-hot explosion of agony. Sam's scream was ripped from his lungs, a raw, primal sound that startled a flock of crows into the gray sky. He collapsed backward, his head striking the earth, as the crushing pressure on his lower leg sent waves of nausea rolling through his gut. For a moment, his vision blurred into a hazy red tunnel, and the old ghosts of the desert returned, the smell of burning rubber, the ringing in his ears after a roadside blast. He was trapped. The pine was a tombstone of wood, unmoving and merciless. He tried to shove against the trunk, his fingers clawing at the rough bark until they bled. But it was like trying to push a mountain. The cold began to seep in immediately, the damp earth beneath him leaching the heat from his body. He was 5 miles from the nearest trail, alone in a wilderness that didn't care if he lived or died. "Shadow!" he gasped, his voice a jagged whisper of pain. "Shadow, come." The German shepherd was there in an instant, his cold nose pressing against Sam's cheek, his whimpers filled with an almost human distress. Shadow didn't panic. He began to dig frantically at the earth beneath Sam's leg, trying to create a gap, his powerful paws throwing clumps of red clay into the air. But the rock beneath was solid granite. Seeing the futility of the task, Shadow stopped and looked Sam directly in the eyes. In that moment, the soldier saw the canine. This wasn't just a pet. This was a partner who understood the stakes of survival. Sam felt his consciousness flickering, the edges of his world fraying into gray. The shock was setting in, and he knew that if he fell asleep in this cold, he would never wake up. He grabbed Shadow's ruff, pulling the dog's face close to his. "Go, boy," Sam choked out, gesturing toward the trail that led to Sarah's ridge. "Go get Sarah! Go!" Shadow hesitated for a heartbeat, his loyalty warring with his instinct to stay and protect his fallen packmate. Sam roared the command again, a final burst of military authority fueled by desperation. With a sharp, commanding bark, Shadow turned and vanished into the undergrowth, a streak of black and tan lightning disappearing into the mist. For the next few hours, Sam Miller drifted between a waking nightmare and a cold, painless void. He watched the light change on the leaves, the shadows growing long and predatory. He thought of Elias, wondering if this was how his friend had felt in those final moments, trapped, watching the sky, waiting for a rescue that might never come. The pain in his leg had subsided into a dull, rhythmic throb, a sign that the circulation was dying. He began to recite the names of his old unit, a litany of ghosts to keep his mind anchored. He was lulled by the freezing wind, his eyes fluttering shut, when a distant frantic barking pierced the veil of his delirium. It was Shadow, his voice raw and persistent, growing louder with every second. And then came other sounds, the heavy thud of boots and the sharp crack of branches. "Over here!" a deep, unfamiliar voice shouted. "The dogs found him! Keep up, Sarah!" Emerging from the trees was a man Sam hadn't met. Hank Thorne, Elias's cousin and a local volunteer firefighter. Hank was a bear of a man, nearly 60, with a chest like an oak barrel and a beard as thick and tangled as a briar patch. He carried a heavy hydraulic jack and a chainsaw, his face a mask of grim determination. Beside him was Sarah, her silver hair windblown and her face pale with worry, clutching a medical kit to her chest. Hank didn't waste a second on pleasantries. He assessed the pinned leg with the practiced eye of a man who had pulled people from wrecked trucks for 30 years. "Hold on, son," Hank grunted, his voice a low rumble of comfort. "We're gonna get you out. That dog of yours, he ran clear to my porch and wouldn't stop baying till I followed. He's a damn hero." As Hank worked the jack, the massive log began to groan, shifting just inches, enough to release the pressure. Sarah knelt by Sam's side, her cool hands on his forehead, whispering words of encouragement as she checked his vitals. When they finally slid Sam free, the agony returned with a vengeful roar as the blood rushed back into his crushed tissues. He gasped, his hand reaching out blindly, and found the thick, warm fur of Shadow's neck. The dog had returned, his chest heaving, his paws bloodied and torn from the 5-mile sprint through the jagged mountain terrain. Shadow let out a soft, weary whimper and licked the sweat from Sam's brow. As Hank and a few other neighbors who had followed began to settle Sam onto a makeshift litter, Sam looked at the dog and felt a profound, soul-deep realization. He had come to the mountains to be alone, to hide from a world that had broken him. He had thought Shadow was just a companion to keep the silence from being too loud. But in the cold shadow of that fallen pine, he realized that their lives were no longer separate threads. They were woven together by blood and a loyalty that defied the limits of nature. Sam wasn't just a man with a dog. He was a man who owed his very breath to a creature that had refused to let him go. As they carried him down the ridge under the rising moon, Sam kept his hand buried in Shadow's fur, the dog walking steadily by his side, two survivors bound by a trial that had turned a clearing in the woods into a sacred ground of rebirth. The first frost had arrived like a silent thief in the night, coating the hemlocks in a delicate, brittle silver and turning the red clay of the ridge into a hard, unforgiving crust. Samuel Miller stood in the center of the skeletal frame of his house, his breath hitching in the crystalline air as a plume of white mist. The stone hearth he had built with Silas was now a towering, silent sentinel, the names of his fallen brothers etched deep into the granite, waiting for the first fire to bring them back to life. But before the floorboards could be laid and the walls sealed against the coming mountain winter, Sam had one final, grueling task. He needed a root cellar. In these mountains, survival depended on the earth's ability to keep things from freezing, and a deep, stone-lined hole beneath the main room was a necessity Elias had often mentioned in those long, dusty nights in the desert. Sam moved with a rhythmic, measured caution, his left leg still reminding him of the pine's crushing weight, with a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. He began to break the frozen surface with a pickaxe, the metallic thud echoing through the quiet forest, while Shadow paced restlessly around the perimeter of the foundation. As the morning progressed, Sam noticed a shift in Shadow's behavior that went beyond his usual vigilance. Usually, the German Shepherd would find a patch of sunlight and keep watch, but today, his focus was narrowed to a specific corner of the foundation, near where a massive, ancient oak root snaked deep beneath the earth. Shadow began to whimper, a low, urgent sound that vibrated in his chest, and his powerful paws started to tear at the dirt with a frantic intensity Sam had never seen. "Easy, boy," Sam grunted, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "It's just dirt. We've got enough digging to do without you making a mess of the corners." But Shadow ignored him, his ears flattened against his skull, his tail tucked low as he excavated a hole with surgical precision. He wasn't chasing a squirrel or a groundhog. He was searching for something buried. The dog's obsession was so total that Sam eventually dropped his shovel and knelt beside him, his combat engineer's intuition tingling with a sudden, unexplainable electricity. There was something intentional about the way Shadow was digging, not like an animal, but like a soldier uncovering a cache. Sam took over with a hand trowel, moving carefully through the layers of packed clay and tangled roots. About 2 feet down, the blade of the trowel struck something that didn't sound like stone or wood. It was the hollow, unmistakable clink of metal on metal. Sam's heart skipped a beat, the old instincts of a minesweeper surging to the surface. He cleared the dirt away with his bare hands, ignoring the stinging cold of the frozen earth, until the corner of an olive-drab box emerged. It was a standard-issue military ammo box, rusted at the seams and sealed with a heavy layer of waterproof wax. Sam pulled it from the earth, the weight of it surprising him. It felt like a piece of his old life had been buried here, waiting for him to arrive. Shadow stopped digging and sat back on his haunches, letting out a long, weary sigh as he watched Sam's hands. The dog's amber eyes were filled with a strange, ancient knowing, a look of profound relief that sent a shiver down Sam's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. With trembling fingers, Sam pried the rusted latch open. The air inside the box smelled of cedar, gun oil, and a faint, lingering scent of the desert, a smell that made Sam's vision blur for a momentary heartbeat. On top of a stack of papers lay a set of hand-drawn blueprints, sketched on heavy vellum in the unmistakable, messy scrawl of Elias Thorne. As Sam unfurled the sheets, he saw the very house he was building. Elias had designed it all: the stone hearth, the ridge beam, the placement of the windows to catch the morning sun. It wasn't just a dream Elias had talked about. It was a plan he had finalized before their last deployment. Underneath the blueprints sat a small, leather-bound journal and a single faded photograph protected by a plastic sleeve. Sam picked up the photo, and the breath was sucked from his lungs as if he'd been hit by a mortar blast. It was a picture of Elias, younger and laughing, standing in front of this very oak tree. In his arms, he held a gangly, oversized German shepherd puppy with a distinctive, jagged white fleck of fur on its left ear, the exact same mark that Shadow carried. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sam looked from the photo to the dog sitting before him. He reached out, his hand shaking, and gently turned Shadow's left ear. There it was, the Braveheart mark, as Elias had called it in his letters home. The truth hit Sam with the force of a tidal wave. Shadow wasn't just a stray he had found in a Chicago shelter by chance. Shadow had been Elias's dog, the pup Elias had sent home to his family just months before he was killed. Sarah's words from weeks ago echoed in Sam's mind. The old forest always knows how to bring back those who were lost. When Elias's family had faced their own tragedies after his death, the dog must have been lost, ending up in the system, drifting through shelters until he smelled a familiar scent. The scent of Elias's gear, the smell of the motor oil Sam used, the lingering aura of a man who had shared a foxhole with his first master. Shadow hadn't just found Sam, he had recognized a brother in arms. He had led Sam out of the city and back to this ridge to fulfill a promise Elias couldn't keep. The news of the discovery beneath the ancient oak did not travel by wire or wave, but through the mountain telegraph, a whispered word over a fence post, a shared glance at the general store, and the soft, knowing nods of people who believed that the earth held onto its secrets until the right soul arrived to claim them. Samuel Miller sat on the tailgate of his Ford F-150 the morning after finding the ammo box, his fingers tracing the faded ink of Elias's blueprints while Shadow sat at his feet, looking more like a sentinel than a stray. The heavy weight of the past 24 hours still pressed against Sam's chest, but it was no longer the suffocating pressure of grief. It was the gravity of a legacy. He wore his beige canvas jacket, the rugged fabric stained with the red clay of the ridge, and his dark charcoal chinos were dusted with the gray powder of the granite he had been carving. When the sound of multiple engines began to echo up the winding dirt track, Sam's hand instinctively went to Shadow's collar, his old combat-trained heart fluttering with a brief, vestigial spark of defensive caution. But as the lead vehicle, a battered green Jeep, broke through the mist, followed by a small convoy of pickup trucks, He saw the silver-haired figure of Sarah Higgins in the passenger seat, and behind her, the grisly silhouette of Hank Thorne. The convoy came to a halt in the clearing, the engines ticking as they cooled in the sharp mountain air. From the trucks emerged a group of men and women who looked as though they had been forged from the very timber and stone of the Blue Ridge. Among them was Jackson Mac McAllister, a man in his early 70s who moved with a slight, rhythmic limp that mirrored Sam's own. Mac was a Vietnam veteran with a face that resembled a piece of sun-bleached driftwood, deeply furrowed, weathered, and possessing a sharp hooked nose that gave him the appearance of an aging hawk. He wore a faded flannel shirt tucked into high-waisted work pants, and a leather tool belt was slung low over his narrow hips. Mac was a master carpenter by trade, a man who could hear the song in a piece of raw oak before the saw ever touched it. He walked straight up to Sam, his eyes, as blue and cold as a winter creek, fixing on the blueprints in Sam's hand. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he pointed a gnarled, scarred finger at the sketches. "Elias always was a dreamer with a pencil," Mac remarked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "But he never did understand how much a ridgepole could sag in a heavy, wet snow. We're here to make sure his lines hold up, son." Behind Mac stood Layla, a woman in her late 30s with skin the color of dark mahogany and hair cropped close to her skull. She was a former Army mechanic, possessing the thick, powerful forearms of someone who spent their life wrestling with iron. Her gaze was steady and professional, her movements economical. She didn't say much, but she began unloading a stack of reclaimed cedar planks from the back of her truck, with a strength that commanded immediate respect. These people hadn't come for charity. They had come because the story of Shadow, the Braveheart pup who had found his way home, had struck a chord in a community that valued loyalty above all else. They saw in Sam not a stranger, but a brother in arms who had been carrying a pack far too heavy for one man to bear. As Hank Thorne began to organize the unloading of several large, double-pane glass windows, salvaged from an old schoolhouse renovation, Sam felt a strange, uncomfortable heat rise in his throat. For a decade, he had built walls to keep the world out, believing that his mission was a solitary one. Learning to open the gate was a struggle that far exceeded the physical labor of hauling stone. The clearing, once a place of lonely penance, was suddenly transformed into a theater of collective purpose. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of hammers, the high-pitched whine of Layla's chainsaw, and the low, steady rumble of Mac's instructions created a symphony of construction that drowned out the ghosts of Chicago. Sam found himself working alongside Mac, the old carpenter showing him the subtle art of notching the logs so they locked together like the teeth of a mountain lion. Mac was patient but firm, his humor as dry as tinder. "You're overthinking the grain, Miller," Mac said with a crooked grin, gesturing with a hand missing the tip of its index finger. "The wood knows where it wants to go. You're just the one helping it get there. It's like being a sergeant. You don't tell the men how to walk. You just show them the destination." Sam found himself laughing, a short, surprised sound that felt foreign in his chest. At the old man's wit, the humor was a bridge, a way for Sam to let down his guard without feeling vulnerable. By midday, the walls had risen 3 tiers higher, and the skeletal frame of the roof was beginning to take shape. Sarah Higgins had set up a makeshift kitchen on a pair of sawhorses, serving bowls of thick venison stew and cornbread that tasted of wood smoke and honey. As they sat together on the stone hearth Sam had carved, the veterans began to share stories. Not the traumatic tales of the battlefield, but the small, human moments of service. They spoke of the dogs they had known, the letters they had waited for, and the strange, beautiful silence that comes after a mission is finally complete. Shadow sat in the center of the group, his tail giving an occasional, rhythmic thump against the dirt, his eyes moving from face to face as if he were taking roll call. The dog wasn't just a pet anymore. He was the catalyst for a shared healing. Sam watched as Mac reached out to scratch Shadow behind the ears, the old man's rough hands moving with a gentleness that spoke of 1,000 hidden kindnesses. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting a long, golden glow over the rising house, Sam stood back and looked at the work. The structure was no longer just a pile of materials he had struggled to master alone. It was a physical manifestation of solidarity. Each beam had been lifted by multiple hands, each window placed with shared effort. He realized that the sanctuary he had been building was not just the four walls and a roof, but the community that now surrounded him. For the first time, the army of one had disbanded, replaced by a pack that looked out for its own. He looked at the blueprints Elias had drawn, and then at the neighbors who were packing up their tools, promising to return the next morning. Sam didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt like a man who had finally found the right foundation. He reached out and shook Mac's hand, the grip firm and honest. And for the first time in his life, Sam Miller didn't look for the exit. He looked at the home they were building together, and he knew that the stones Elias loved so much were finally, truly in place. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum by mid-afternoon, a heavy, low-hanging ceiling that smelled of ozone and ice. Samuel Miller stood on the peak of his new home, his hammer striking the final copper nail into a cedar shingle with a rhythmic, final thack. Above him, the mountain air had sharpened into a predatory chill, the kind that didn't just touch the skin, but sought the marrow. Mac and Layla had left only an hour before, urged by the local radio's frantic warnings of an early-season nor'easter that was currently clawing its way up the Appalachian spine. They had helped him hoist the massive ridge beam, the spine Elias had dreamed of, and sealed the last of the double-paned windows just as the first few flakes of snow began to dance like ghost moths in the dimming light. Sam wiped a bead of cold sweat from his temple, his beige canvas jacket stiff with the frozen mist, and looked out over the ridge. The forest was holding its breath. The usual chatter of squirrels and the distant cry of hawks had vanished, replaced by a hollow, expectant silence. He climbed down the sturdy ladder Mac had left behind, his injured leg giving a dull, familiar throb, and stepped into the main room. It was the first time he had stood inside a structure that was truly whole. The smell was intoxicating, a cocktail of freshly sawn cedar, the earthy musk of the drying mortar in the hearth, and the faint, sweet scent of the pine needles he had tracked in on his boots. By the time the sun had vanished behind a wall of white, the storm had arrived in full, feral glory. The wind didn't just blow, it shrieked around the stone corners of the house, a banshee wail that would have once sent Sam diving for cover. But as the snow began to pile against the glass, creating a soft, muffling insulation, Sam felt a strange, unprecedented sense of sanctuary. He knelt before the massive stone hearth, the heart he had carved with such painstaking grief, and prepared the first fire. He used shavings from the cedar shingles and dry kindling he had hoarded in the root cellar. As the first match flared, the flame caught and climbed, licking hungrily at the seasoned oak logs. The light began to dance across the granite slabs, and one by one, the names he had etched into the stone began to glow. Elias Thorne, Jackson, Miller, Ross. The names weren't just carvings anymore. In the flickering orange light, they seemed to pulse with a warmth of their own, as if the spirits of his brothers had finally come in from the cold to share the hearth with him. Shadow lay curled on a thick wool rug. Silas Vane had dropped off, his chin resting on his paws, his intelligent eyes reflecting the fire. The dog let out a long, contented sigh, his body finally losing the tactical tension that had defined him since the city. Shadow wasn't just resting, he was home. As the storm raged outside, turning the world into a chaotic blur of white, Sam reached into the olive-drab ammo box and pulled out a thick, leather-bound journal he had purchased during his last trip into Blackwood with Hank. He sat in a heavy oak chair Layla had helped him build, the wood smooth and honest beneath his calloused palms. For years, Sam had carried his memories like unexploded ordnance, volatile, heavy, and dangerous to touch. He had fled to the mountains to bury them, but as he looked at Elias's name glowing in the firelight, he realized that burial was not the same as peace. He uncapped an old fountain pen, the nib hovering over the cream-colored page. The silence of the room was heavy, but it was no longer the haunting silence of the void. It was a fertile silence, waiting for a story. His hand trembled as he wrote the first words. "My name is Samuel Miller, and I am the one who lived." The writing came slowly at first, like water struggling to break through an ice-choked stream. He wrote of the heat that felt like a physical weight, the smell of burning diesel, and the way the sand got into everything: your food, your eyes, your soul. He wrote about the day he met Elias, the red-haired giant who could make a joke in the middle of a firefight, and the way they had promised each other that they would find a ridge where the air tasted like cold water. For the first time, Sam didn't shy away from the pain. He let the ink bleed into the paper as he described the loss of Private Miller, the boy who loved jazz, and the final moments of Elias Thorne. As he wrote, the pressure in his chest began to ebb. It was a brutal, agonizing harvest of his own soul, but each sentence felt like a stitch in a wound that had been open for a decade. He wasn't running anymore. He was standing his ground on a battlefield of paper and ink. Shadow moved then, sensing the shift in Sam's internal weather. The German shepherd stood up, his claws clicking softly on the new floorboards, and walked over to sit beside Sam's chair. He didn't nudge or whimper. He simply leaned his heavy, warm shoulder against Sam's leg, a solid presence in the flickering shadows. Sam looked down at the dog, at the brave heart mark on his ear, and the calm, forgiving depths of his amber eyes. In that gaze, Sam found the one thing he had never been able to give himself: forgiveness. Shadow didn't blame him for being the survivor. Shadow didn't see a broken man. He saw the builder who had fulfilled a promise. The dog's absolute, unwavering love was a mirror that reflected a Sam he was finally starting to recognize. A man of resilience, a man of honor, a man who was worthy of the peace he had built. Sam reached down and buried his fingers in Shadow's thick fur, the warmth of the dog and the warmth of the fire merging into a single, radiant force. The storm continued to howl, a reminder of the harsh, unforgiving world beyond the stone walls. But inside, the atmosphere was one of profound salvation. Sam realized that the house was more than just stone and log. It was a vessel for the spirits of the men he had lost, a place where their names would be spoken and their lives remembered. He looked at the names on the hearth and realized they weren't ghosts haunting him. They were the foundation he stood upon. He picked up the pen again, his heart feeling lighter than it had since he was a boy. He began to write not just of the war, but of the ridge, of the sweetness of Sarah's pie, the dry wit of Mac, and the miracle of a dog that had found his way home across 1,000 miles of concrete. As the fire settled into a bed of glowing embers, Sam felt the last of the Chicago winter thaw within him. He was no longer a ghost of the past. He was a chronicler of the present. He closed the journal, the leather cool and solid in his hand, and watched the snow pile up against the window. For the first time in his life, Samuel Miller wasn't afraid of the morning. He was home, and he was finally truly free. The mountain winter did not depart with a roar, but with a slow, crystalline weeping. For months, the ridge had been a world of white silence. But as the calendar turned toward April, the iron grip of the frost finally began to soften. The snow retreated into the deep shadows of the hollows, leaving behind a soil that was dark, rich, and hungrily alive. Samuel Miller stood on the porch of his completed home, a mug of steaming coffee held in hands that were now permanently etched with the honorable scars of labor. The house stood behind him like a living thing, a symphony of silvered cedar and blue-gray granite that seemed to have grown naturally out of the mountain slope. It was no longer the skeletal ruin Elias had left. It was a sanctuary. The windows, once empty sockets staring into a void, now caught the honey-colored light of the spring sun, reflecting a world that had transformed from a theater of ghosts into a garden of rebirth. Sam himself had undergone a metamorphosis that mirrored the land. The stoop in his shoulders had vanished, replaced by the upright, easy strength of a man who knew his place in the world. His salt and pepper beard had grown thicker, neatly groomed, and his sea-gray eyes had lost their haunted, hyper-vigilant flicker. They were clear now, settled and observant, the eyes of a builder who had finally found a foundation that wouldn't shift. Beside him, Shadow sat with the quiet dignity of a king. The German shepherd's coat was thick and lustrous, his amber eyes following the flight of a pair of bluebirds nesting in a nearby hemlock. Shadow had become more than a companion. He was the soul of the ridge. The brave heart mark on his ear was a badge of a mission accomplished. He no longer leaned against Sam's leg to stop a panic attack. He leaned against him out of a simple, profound affection. They had survived the winter together, a man and a dog who had forged a new language in the silence of the snow. But as the forest woke up, Sam realized that the peace he had found was too precious to keep to himself. He remembered the cold, suffocating labyrinths of Chicago and the thousands of men like him who were still fighting wars in their own minds. He looked at the extra space Mac and Layla had helped him build, the wide, sun-drenched training deck and the cozy guest quarters, and he knew what the next mission had to be. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a bridge. The first of the new recruits had arrived a week ago. Danny Vance was a 27-year-old Marine who had returned from overseas with eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world. Danny was lean and jittery, his hands constantly moving, his gaze never settling on anything for more than a second. He reminded Sam so much of himself 3 years ago that it made his chest ache. Danny had brought with him a young golden retriever mix named Daisy, a floppy-eared, overexcited pup who didn't yet know how to read the clouds of Danny's mind. Sam had spent the morning showing Danny how to listen to the dog, using the same quiet, firm discipline he had learned from Shadow. Sam's humor, once a dry and buried thing, had resurfaced as a tool for healing. "She's not a weapon, Danny," Sam said with a crooked grin, watching as Daisy tried to chase her own tail. "She's a mirror. If you're at war with yourself, she's going to be at war with that tail. Breathe. Let the mountain do the heavy lifting for a minute." Danny had laughed, a short, startled sound that reminded Sam of the first time he had laughed with Mac. It was the sound of a heart beginning to thaw. Shadow played a vital role in this new endeavor. He was the lead K9, a stoic instructor who taught the younger dogs the art of vigilance and calm. When a trainee dog became too restless, Shadow would simply walk over and stand near them, his powerful, steady presence acting as a natural tranquilizer. The veterans who came to the Ridge didn't find a clinical environment, they found a brotherhood. They found a man who knew what the nightmares felt like and a dog who knew how to pull you out of them. The house, once an indomitable fortress of solitude, had become a lighthouse. Mac and Layla visited often, Mac bringing his woodworking tools to teach the younger vets how to carve, and Layla showing them how to maintain the equipment. The community that had built the house had expanded into a network of healing, a pack that refused to leave any member behind. On this particular afternoon, the air was filled with the scent of wild ramps and damp pine. Sam was working in the small garden patch he had cleared near the ancient oak, when the familiar rumble of a truck echoed up the trail. A few moments later, Sarah Higgins appeared, her silver hair shimmering in the afternoon light like a halo of spun silk. She was carrying a burlap-wrapped bundle in her arms, her blue eyes twinkling with a secret joy. Behind her walked Hank Thorne, carrying a set of gardening tools and a bag of enriched soil. Sarah approached the house, her gaze lingering on the stone hearth that Sam had carved. She looked at the names of the fallen men, now softened by the passage of time and the warmth of the home, and she nodded in silent approval. "The forest is pleased with you, Sam Miller," she said in her melodic Appalachian lilt. "You've turned a place of sorrow into a place of song." Sarah knelt in the center of the yard, gesturing for Sam to join her. She unwrapped the burlap to reveal a young flowering dogwood sapling, its branches delicate and budding with the promise of white blossoms. "This is for the yard," she whispered. "In these mountains, a dogwood is a sign of endurance. It blooms after the hardest winters, reminding us that beauty always finds a way back." Sam knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands working with her gnarled ones to dig a shallow hole in the rich red clay. As they firmed the soil around the base of the sapling, Sam felt a profound sense of closure. He thought of Elias, imagining his friend's boisterous laugh echoing through the trees. He realized that the ridge Elias had promised wasn't just a destination. It was a state of being. He had built the house, he had found the dog, and he had reclaimed his soul. He had taken the stones of his past and used them to build a future for others. As Sarah and Hank headed back to the porch for a glass of cold tea, Sam stayed in the yard for a moment, watching the way the late afternoon sun turned the dogwood's buds into pearls of light. Shadow, seeing that the work was done, let out a joyful bark and began to race across the clearing, his powerful legs eating up the ground, his tail wagging with a pure, unadulterated happiness. He wasn't a K9 on duty or a stray in a cage. He was a dog in his own woods. Sam stood up, brushing the dirt from his chinos, and a genuine wide smile broke across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. He looked at the house, the mountains, and the people who had become his family. He looked at the dog who had led him through the dark and into the light. The echoes of the concrete were gone, replaced by the whispering leaves and the steady beat of a heart that was finally at peace. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was home. And for the first time in his life, Samuel Miller knew that home was not a place you find, but a place you have the courage to build. The journey of Sam and Shadow on Blue Ridge is far more than a story of stone and wood. It is a sacred testament to the resilience of the human spirit. From the deafening echoes of a concrete jungle to the healing silence of the mountains, Sam proved that even the deepest scars can become the foundation of a beautiful new life. Shadow was never just a dog. He was a miracle of destiny, a living bridge to a promise kept across time. Their story reminds us that no matter how broken we feel, there is always a sanctuary waiting to be built. And no matter how lost we are, love will always find a way to lead us home. Sometimes God does not send his miracles in flashes of lightning from the heavens. Instead, he sends them in the wag of a loyal tail, the quiet strength of a neighbor's hand, or the warmth of a hearth built with honor. It is his gentle way of whispering into our weary hearts, "You are never alone." Trust that the trials you face today are merely the stones being laid for your own path to peace. If Sam and Shadow's journey has touched your soul or rekindled your hope, please share this story with someone who needs to hear it. We invite you to leave a comment with your prayers and thoughts, and subscribe to join our community of healing. May God bless you and your loved ones with comfort, grace, and an everlasting spring in your hearts. Keep the faith, for his light shines brightest in the places we once thought were dark. God bless you all.